Welcome to the Tough Decisions Podcast, special Sunday edition called Survive and Thrive with Dennae. Each Sunday, Dennae will go through a specifically selected book to dive deep into the life decisions that we make on a regular basis as entrepreneurs and real estate investors. And now, your host, Dennae Handford.
Hello, and welcome to the Tough Decisions Podcast. This is our special Sunday edition. I'm your host, Dennae. This day of the week is my day for my show, and so we'll talk a little bit about what that means here in just a second. But today I also have Dan on with me, and so we're going to be discussing today's topics together.
Hello, glad to be on. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm glad you're on too, because I'm not sure that I can, go for hours and hours by myself. So
I'm pretty sure you probably can.
Wait. What does that mean? We're going to be looking at some really interesting topics here on these Sunday shows. So I'm really looking forward to it. Let me tell you first what these Sunday shows are going to be about. It's called Survive and Thrive with Dennae. And my goal is to take some of the most influential or most important books that have changed the way I think, either about business or life, or even if it's not a whole way of thinking, of just giving me some really important nuggets, if you will, to change the way and become more effective way I do things. Then we're going to take those books and, do a brief summary, talk about the most important topics, talk about how we can apply them and what the most important ideas from those books are. I'm an avid reader. I really enjoy reading, and I think it's a great way to continue your education even after you're out of school, per se. And some of the most important things that I've learned from, not from a teacher or from school, but from reading a book or reading a good author. So I'm really looking forward to this Sunday show. The first book we're going to look at, or we're going to talk about, is a book called Leaders Eat Last. It's written by Sinek. He's a very important and very influential author on business, entrepreneurship, and some of you may have heard of some other books that he's read. Probably the most well-known one is his book called Start With Why. And in that book, he discusses how important it is that small businesses especially, but really any organization, know the real why behind their existence. Because if you don't know the why, then you're going to have trouble making those really important decisions. And then he's written this book. He's written another one in there that it kind of jumps off from that first one. And now he's written this one called Leaders Eat Last. And this book is really written to leaders of those big organizations, big or small, I guess, but those organizations, small businesses, and how they can really develop leadership in their company, and so that their people feel secure, but they are also free to be innovative and creative and make the company move forward. This book starts out with an example from the Marine Corps, and he actually uses the military as throughout the book to illustrate his most important points, if you will. And he starts with the need for good leadership. He actually says, I thought this was really the main idea, that he's never seen any company or organization that was, quote, managed out of a crisis. And he's studied a lot of corporations, a lot of businesses, all sizes. He's never seen one that was managed out of a crisis. They were all led out of a crisis. And he really develops a difference between management and leadership. And most of the time, if you think about it, the college courses that we have for business, they are all focused on developing effective managers, when really we need to be more focused on developing good or great leaders, because a great leader is what every organization needs, and not just one, but multiple great leaders. Especially the larger they get, then the more levels of good leaders that you need. Because as he talks about later in the book, we can really only relate to about 100 to 150 people within our social circles at one time. So if you get a really large corporation and you're asking your leaders to manage thousands of people at one time, that's when it becomes very impersonal. But that's for a later date. The title of the book is developed also very interestingly. In the Marine Corps, the most junior officers are served first. And the senior officers, they wait until every single officer that's beneath them has eaten, and then they eat. And he uses this to illustrate the Marine Corps' approach to leadership is The true price of leadership is the willingness to place needs of others above your own. And why is that so important? It makes those junior officers feel secure in their leader. Another way of saying that is the true cost of leadership privilege comes at the expense of self-interest. So when you become a leader of any sort within the organization, you have to be willing to put the needs of your juniors, if you will, above your own, and the needs of the organization as a whole above your own. When that happens, then those people beneath you feel secure, they feel safe, and they're free to do their jobs in an effective, creative manner. He also uses another example of actually a military mission, a specific mission. And this actually happened in 2002. So think back in your history just a little bit. It was actually less than a year than the 9/11 attacks of 2001. And so our military was very, very heavily involved in combat missions in the Middle East and Far East. And he gives the example of this fighter pilot who was flying cover, if you will, for this 22-man team that was on the ground. Now, the actual mission is still classified to this day, so we still don't know exactly what they were doing. But the unclassified part tells us that this 22-man team was actually moving, and I quote, a high-value target to a safe house. And they knew that they were in enemy territory, so as is customary, they had a fighter pilot, actually two of them, flying cover for them. And their job was to basically fly over this 22-man team and just make sure that they had support if it was needed, if they were attacked, if they ran into any problems. So the code name for this pilot, his name was Johnny Bravo. He was flying cover, and he said that he couldn't see anything that was going on because there was very thick cloud cover, but he just felt like he needed to dip down below the clouds and just almost like saying hello to the 22-man team. Just, I'm here, I've got your back if you need me. And right as he started to do that, one of the men on the ground, the 22 men, radioed that there was, quote, troops in contact, which basically meant somebody's in trouble. And so Johnny Bravo, his job then was to dip down, figure out what was going on, and provide the support they needed. Now, the interesting thing is they were in the Afghan mountains, and they had old maps. It was cloudy. He had very little visibility, and he was supposed to fly cover for them without running into any mountains or crashing or anything like that. And the long and short of it is a very dangerous thing that he did. He dipped down below the clouds, he flew cover for them, and he actually was counting in his head 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, and he knew approximately how much time, how much space he had and how fast he was going, and then he would pull back on his airplane control and pull the plane up, circle around, and do this same thing over and over again to get those troops out of trouble. And so obviously it was a very brave thing that he did. All 22 men made it out alive. They had no casualties for the U.S. troops. And what the lesson comes in when he was interviewed later, because they asked him, why would you do that? I mean, it was extremely dangerous. And to make it even more amazing is he and that 22-man team had never met each other. He was in the Air Force. They were in the Marines, I believe. And so they actually didn't even know each other, but they were assigned to this same mission, and they eventually met later, of course. But they asked him, why did you do that? And the answer that he gave them is, they would have done it for me. And so the lesson that Simon Sinek pulls out for us is that the key to being an effective team is what he calls empathy. Now, most of the time we think of empathy as being able to feel the same thing as another person, and that is to an extent what he's referring to here, but you take it a little bit further, and it's basically experiencing the same feelings and experiences of another member of the team. And he says the reason he did it is because they would have done it for me. So they had never met one another. They were both trained as military or by the U.S. military. And here they were. And he knew that if he was in the same position, that somebody would have his back. And that's really what this book is about, is developing a team of people and being the kind of leader where your people understand that you have their back. And that's when they can perform their best. In his study of what he would call the most successful organizations, Sinek found a pattern. He said that these exceptional organizations all have cultures in which the leaders, quote, provide cover from above, and the people on the ground look out for each other. So they're free to look out for each other because they're not looking out for themselves because they know someone else has their back. This is the reason they're willing to push hard and take the risks that they do. And the way any organization can achieve this is with empathy. So when you identify with that other person and you experience vicariously their position, their feelings, then you have that empathy and you can, you know that someone's got your back and you can provide cover for the other people, either equal to you or below you. And that's the way you develop an effective organization. So thoughts, Dan, have any of these things? I know you and I have talked about some of these things before, and we've got several layers of managers now in our businesses. Any thoughts on how we've seen this play out?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I would say that the thing that first struck me was when you were talking about, placing the needs of others above yourself. In business, one of the things that, I see quite often in leaders of a small business that are, I would consider those what you would call true leaders or the true price of leadership, having that willingness to place the needs of others above your own, is when you have a month or 2 or 3 months or a period of time where, the revenue is kind of falling behind and, sometimes it's hard to make payroll. And so to be able to take it to that next level and say, you know what, I'm going to forego myself getting paid so that my staff can get paid so that we can continue this process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a really important part of it. If you have that right team in place and you know what you're doing is going to be effective, the short-term sacrifices sometimes have to be made, and you don't want your staff to be able, or your employees to have to make that sacrifice. And sometimes, in all honesty, they're not able to make that sacrifice like, the leader might be able to. So that's also an element to account for there. Sometimes it may not seem like they notice that, but they do, and there's no need to go and tell them. They know when the revenue is not what it should be, or they know when things are not as productive as they need to be. They feel that, but they also feel that sacrifice that's being made by their leader because, A, they believe in what they're doing, and they're willing to sacrifice so that we can move the whole organization forward. That's the key, is moving the whole organization and brings them up with the organization as well.
One of the other things I was going to mention about your Johnny Bravo story on flying cover, I thought of Warren Buffett, and he has, lots of different companies, and obviously he's on a much larger scale than any one of us for a variety of reasons, but he stays in contact as the leader in these organizations with the leaders in those organizations as well. And so I kind of think of him as being that Johnny Bravo person where he kind of steps in and, he has a very regular schedule where he actually touches base with these leaders and said, just, kind of like you said there, he kind of like, goes down underneath the clouds and just says, hey, I'm here for you. I want to know how things are going on. If there's anything I can do to help you, let me know. And then he goes back above the clouds and he kind of goes on to the next, thing that he's doing. But all of those leaders know that they can reach out to him and get his advice or his opinion on something or his help if they need it.
Right. And that's actually really important because once you get to a situation where the business or the organization is large enough to have multiple layers of leaders, the leaders have to also feel comfortable. They can't always be looking over their shoulder going, oh no, what's going to happen when the boss comes in today? They can't feel that insecurity either, or they can't provide the proper leadership for the people under them. So I like that example. We've talked about Warren Buffett before too, and how he talks with them. I can't remember exactly what the regularity of it is, like once a week or once a month or something, that he has a meeting with them and talks with them, basically just saying, I'm here. Let me know if there's anything I can do. They feel that security, and then they can in turn provide that for their own people.
Right.
The next chapter begins with a corporate example. So he's gone from the military. Now Sinek is kind of showing us how this plays out in business. And he used the example of a man named Bob Chapman, who was actually the CEO of multiple manufacturing companies, which he purchased while they were all failing businesses. And he would go into them with the goal of changing the culture. And he came to this determination in all of them. He said that the job of the leadership was to provide a safety or security to the employees so that they're free to do their job with excellence and innovation. The internal trust and cooperation begins with that cover from above, like we were just talking about, and employees can then be free to defend the organization from outside dangers. And that's really the first time he talks about the internal versus the external dangers. So Internal dangers or let's start with the external, actually. The external dangers to a corporation would be anything that threatens the life of the corporation from outside, like new technology. We've seen even in our own town, like a McDonald's come up with a new robotic ordering system. So they technically don't have to have people standing there taking people's orders because they have this new technology of, ordering at a kiosk, basically, a computer. So that's an example on a different level, but new technology can make old businesses no longer viable. Competitors are obviously always trying to take away your advantage or your edge. There's expectations that you have to meet. I know we've felt that before. People come in, especially if you have a good reputation as a business, people come in and their expectations of you are insanely high, and you have to constantly meet those unless, and if you don't, then they're going to think negatively about the business, even though they might not even expect that from someone else. Capacity blockages. I mean, that threatens your business when you get to a point where you're so busy and you can't grow anymore. And there's other hindrances to growth. Those are all external dangers. You want your staff and your leaders to be free and secure to put their minds to fighting those kind of, quote, dangers to the organization. But if they're constantly worried about internal dangers, like the examples he gives us, intimidation from their leadership, humiliation, isolation, feeling like they're separate from the rest of the team, being made to feel dumb or feeling useless, even rejection, they can't put their energy to fighting the external dangers because they're worried about those things. And the point he makes is that those internal dangers are controllable. And so it should be the goal of leadership to free their culture of those internal dangers so that then they can focus their time and energy and efforts on fighting the external dangers, which are uncontrollable. We really have very little control over what other companies are doing to outcompete with us and outdo us. And then the last chapter here that we're going to just briefly summarize today is he covers why this is all so important. And it's pretty startling when you look at the research that it clearly indicates that the jobs of modern society are actually killing us, literally. Research studies have been done that show that the levels of depression and anxiety among people that are unhappy at work are actually the same or greater than those who are unemployed. And you think about one of the worst situations that you could be in would be, I don't have a job, I don't have regular income. But the people that have a job and are unhappy actually experience more depression and anxiety than those who don't have a job at all. That's pretty startling. There was also a group of studies called the Whitehall studies they're several decades old now, but they show that the higher stress is caused by a lack of control. And it actually has nothing to do with, we would think, the higher you move up in a company, the more stress you feel. Actually, it's the opposite. The lower ranking employees typically felt more stress and what they realized is that it had nothing to do with the demands or the expectations of the job. It was all about the amount of control that you felt over your work. And so for me, I started thinking, well, what can I do to make my employees feel like they have some control over their work? Some interesting ideas, and we'll talk more specifically later, but what can we do to give those people under us some control? Because that affects how they view their job. Those Whitehall studies also show that the stress is not caused by the amount of effort. The correlation between the stress is actually between the imbalance of the work and the amount of reward we feel for that work. So if we feel like we're working, yet there's very little reward, then that causes stress. If we're working really hard, then, that can be an okay thing as long as we feel that it's rewarded. One final one that I thought was interesting, because I think this affects us a lot as entrepreneurs, is it demonstrates the effect of our work on our children. It showed that the hours or the effort of a parent at work does not negatively affect children. So it doesn't matter how late they work, how long you have to work, how difficult the work is. However, how the parent feels about work when they get home from the work dramatically affected the welfare of the children. A child's sense of well-being was affected more by the mood of the parents when they got home from work. So as an entrepreneur or maybe even someone who's thinking about going into business on their own, the question becomes, how do I feel about this work? If what I'm doing is fulfilling and I'm happy there, then that's one thing. But if you feel stuck or trapped and it puts you in a bad mood to be at work, then that can actually affect our families and our children. So I thought that was really, really interesting. He sums all of this up with what he offers as a solution. It's obviously not quitting working. I mean, that's not going to solve anything. But what he says is the solution is to build and maintain what he calls circles of safety. And so that's really the whole premise of the book, is how can we create these circles of safety for ourselves, our leaders, our employees, so that then we can be maximally productive. And that in turn drives the businesses forward and makes us profitable, which is obviously a major goal of a business, but also makes us feel productive and makes us feel like we're contributing to the society in a way that we feel good about.
One of the things that I, stuck out with me was the lack of control. This is kind of what I got from this, is that your lack of control in something increases a higher stress. And even though when you are higher ranking in an organization, you still have control over the people who are under you. So even though you're not necessarily controlling a thing in particular, the more control you can relinquish from yourself to give to your staff that are under you, the less stress you will have, but you still have control because you have control over those employees or those team members. So I think that that's a very important thing to understand is that, in order to have your employees feel like they are not as stressed, you need to give them more control, not like them feel like they're kind of pinned down and kind of locked down. And then that can, again, not only does it affect their livelihood at work, but just like you mentioned, when they go home and they've worked these long hours or, late hours or have some difficulty at work, if they have that control, when they go home, they're not going to feel drained. They're going to go home feeling, fine and not as stressed out and still have energy to have fun and play with the kids and make a meal and sit down with the family at dinner time and various things like that to create those circles of safety.
Exactly. And in turn, when they come back to work the next morning, they're ready and happy to be there as opposed to feeling like, like they're trapped. And I mean, a couple of examples, the CEO that we were talking about, Bob Chapman, and this doesn't work in every situation, but a couple of things he did was he took out the time clocks out of the manufacturing floor. He just took them out and said, they don't have to clock in when they come. They're going to be here. I trust them. That's the key. I trust them to be here and to give their best for the company. And Sinek, he goes on later in the book, and we can talk more when we get there, but he goes on to say, you have to have people that are willing to do that. But when you do find those people, then you turn over, you relinquish that trust, or you give them your trust, you relinquish that control and give it to them. And that's how you keep and develop good employees that you want in your business. Now, another example of what Chapman did is there was, on one of the manufacturing plants, there was a parts room. And it was always locked. And the floor level employees had to come and find a manager and get permission to go in the parts room and get somebody to unlock the door and check out their parts. And of course, that was, you can imagine the reason why they did that is to prevent theft. And Chapman said, no, we're not going to do that. I trust my employees to not steal from me. I trust them to do the very best that they can. And so we're going to unlock the parts room. And I think in one case, he actually did away with the room altogether, and he just created an area of the manufacturing floor where they kept the extra parts, the spare parts, and he put them there, and he allowed his manufacturing employees to access them anytime they needed them. What did that say to them? It said, I trust you. And so that's the key. You need the internal trust and the cooperation that gives cover for those employees to really focus on the external dangers. They don't feel like they're constantly looking over their shoulder and that someone within the organization is looking to harm them or even worse, get rid of them for some reason. So Sinek's solution to these organizational issues: build and maintain circles of safety. And that's what he says a great leader will do for those around him. He'll create a circle of safety and allow the people around him to perform at their maximum because they're safe, they're secure, they feel trusted, they work in cooperation, and so they're able to do the very best that they can. So that wraps up our summary of those first 4 chapters in Leaders Eat Last. Great, great book. It's changed a lot of the things that I think about leadership. Not huge things, but just a change in a frame of reference, a change in perspective, and how you communicate that to your people is really, really important. Join me next Sunday on our Survive and Thrive. We're looking at the book Leaders Eat Last, and we'll look at the next section there and take this a little bit further. What are these circles of safety? How does that work? How do we create them? There's a little bit of history, if you will, biology that we need to go over first. And so we'll look at those, how our hormones of endorphins, dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin interplay and work together, and what that has to do with circles of safety. Very interesting, some of the correlations that Sinek draws for us. So we'll look at that next Sunday on Survive and Thrive.
Make sure to subscribe to our Tough Decisions podcast channel to listen in during the week as Dan and Dennae interview successful entrepreneurs and real estate investors. As business owners, we are faced with tough decisions on a daily basis. These tough decisions can either make us or break us. On the show, you will hear from successful people sharing their stories behind tough decisions that they have had to make along their journey of success. In every episode, you will be able to learn from the thought processes behind the tough decisions that were made. Some of these decisions will have amazing outcomes, and some not so much. So stay tuned for the next daily episode. Do you want to nominate a highly successful entrepreneur or real estate investor to be a guest on this show? Email us at dan@toughdecisions.net. Help us spread the word about the Tough Decisions podcast with your friends. And also take time right now to subscribe and leave a review on iTunes, Facebook, or your favorite platform. You've been listening to the Tough Decisions Show.